What if somebody told you that your whole life was a lie? What will you do? At the beautiful Ura Valley in Bhutan in the year 1995, four backpacker friends, Paul, Ruthie, Greg, and Fiona, go on an adventure to hike a mountain. Finding a hanging bridge on their way, Greg doesn't hesitate to cross, encouraging his friends that it's safe. A little later, they finally reach the summit and gaze over the beauty of nature. Unfortunately, a snowstorm is about to hit, explaining why the monks that they saw earlier on the trail were going down the mountains. Because of this, Ruthie suggests that they should head back as well, which is seconded by Greg. At this time, Paul starts hearing a strange whistling sound, so he shushes his friends, asking if they can hear it too. When they all say no, Paul checks where the sound is coming from, but he suddenly falls in a crevice. Shocked, the three quickly run to the hole. Greg rappels down to check on him, only to find his friend sitting perfectly still in front of a terrifying four-armed giant skeleton. Greg looks closely and finds more bones, so he tells Paul that they need to leave immediately. Strangely, Paul warns Greg that he will die if he touches him. Although he's a bit scared of what his friend had just said, Greg takes his chances and carries Paul back to their friends. Then, they start heading back down to get Paul proper medical attention. But just as they cross the hanging bridge again, Greg falls on his knee in tiredness. Luckily, Ruthie finds an abandoned house nearby to temporarily settle in just in time before the storm hits the mountains. Shortly, while Ruthie is making sure that Paul is comfortable, Fiona asks Greg what he thinks is the problem with their friend. Thinking about it, Greg points out that Paul is not physically injured, so he states that if the problem is not the head, it's probably inside his head. Just then, Ruthie starts freaking out, telling Greg that they need to get Paul to a hospital. Unfortunately, they cannot go right now, as Greg says he cannot carry him around during bad weather. Because of this, he promises that if Paul's condition is not yet improving the next day, they will go down the mountains to seek some help. Later that night, Ruthie is watching over Paul when she finds an object that looks like an instrument. She tries to blow on it, but later on, decides to just put it down and falls asleep. However, she's awakened in the middle of the night by a strange noise. Checking on Greg and Fiona, Ruthie sees them peacefully sleeping, so she just shrugs it off and goes back to sleep. The next day, Greg and Fiona head out as promised, since Paul is still not getting any better. Sometime later, Ruthie sees a figure outside and doesn't hesitate to call for help. However, the figure is just standing still, and this starts to creep her out. Then, all of a sudden, it charges at her, so she runs back inside the house and shuts the door, causing it to start banging the door violently. But, to her confusion, she hears Greg and Fiona telling her to open the door. Inside, Fiona explains that they cannot go through the pass because of the weather. At this time, Ruthie asks if they see someone outside, but they both say no. At night, when everybody is asleep, Paul finally shows some movement as he whispers something indistinctive to Ruthie. The following day, they all wake up and find out that Paul is missing. Fiona then notices that his jacket is gone, so they head out to look for him, following his tracks on the snow. Not long after, they track down Paul sitting in front of the hanging bridge and blowing on the flute that Ruthie found the other night. Seeing that their friend is just meditating, Greg confronts him and says that he's tired of Paul acting so special among them. He's also blaming him for being stuck in the mountains in the middle of a snowstorm. However, Paul just looks at him and says, "I told you." At this time, Ruthie pulls out the knife from her sleeves, stabs Greg multiple times, and pushes him off the cliff. After that, she slits Fiona's throat and tosses her down as well. Just then, she looks at Paul and their eyes lock onto each other as she slowly backs away until she falls. With all of his friends dead, Paul starts blowing the flute again. 23 years later, in Missouri, a former detective named James lives alone after the death of his wife and child in a car accident, and is now just running his own security store. One day, after closing the store, James goes to a diner to celebrate his birthday, taking advantage of the birthday coupon he had for so long. Arriving at home, he sees that her neighbor's daughter, Amanda, is waiting for him on a bench outside. According to her, it has been a year since his family and her father died, so she comes to check on him. As it turns out, James and Amanda's family are very close, and they both suffered a tragic loss 1 year ago. At this time, Amanda shares with James that she found a group that helped her deal with her loss. She expresses that she now feels wonderful and free because that group she's talking about taught her that nothing can ever hurt her because nothing is real. On the contrary, James points out that a lot of things are real and that he learned it the hard way, referring to the death of his family. But Amanda still insists that what she's saying is true, explaining that the only real thing starts in one's mind until it manifests in the world due to focus, intention, and repetition. She then raises a question, bringing up the idea that what if one's thought actually originated from someone or something else and it just travels through them? Confused, James simply answers that he doesn't know what she's talking about. Going back home, he immediately gets to bed and dreams of his family, but it ends with a tragic scream. Because of that, he takes his medicine and starts the day, leaving his wedding ring behind. Unexpectedly, James is called to Nora's house as she tells him that Amanda is missing. Taking him into her daughter's room, he finds out that all of Amanda's clothes are gone. But what's creepy is that there's blood writing on her bathroom that says, "The empty man made me do it." A few minutes later, the police arrive and start questioning Nora about her relationship with Amanda. According to her, they are getting along fine. After all the questions, Detective Villiers tells James that they need to talk outside. Shortly, James goes back to Nora and shares with her the detective's theory that Amanda is just acting up, so she runs away to hurt Nora. Because of this, Nora realizes that the police will barely do anything to find her, which he seconded. Skimming through Amanda's journal, James sees a flyer about the Pontifex Institute with the word tulpa written at the back. Concerned for both Nora and Amanda, James takes matters into his own hands and asks Nora to make him a list of her daughter's friends. Afterward, he goes to Jacques Derrida High School and waits for a student named Devera. He introduces himself as a friend of Amanda's, but Devera turns out to know that already. So he gets straight to the point and asks where Amanda could be, but she has no idea where she is as well. Getting inside his car, they continue their conversation about Amanda. But as she looks at her friends outside, she sees a shadowy figure behind them, scaring her. She then tells James that the police already came by earlier. At this point, he asks if she told them about the empty man, but Devera points out that it was just a silly kid's thing. According to her, she and Amanda were with their other friends at the old chain of rocks bridge 2 nights ago when Amanda found an empty bottle. Legend says that if you blow on an empty bottle on a bridge at night while thinking of the empty man, he will comfort you. On the first day you will hear him. Then on the second day you will see him. And on the third day he will get you. Intrigued, they all tried it and were scared away when they heard a thudding noise from the darker end of the bridge. Hearing this, James asks when she last saw Amanda, and Devera says she saw her at the mall with one of their male friends whispering something to him. Looking back at her friends, she's surprised to see that the field is empty. But what scares her more is when she sees all of her friends sitting down like they are meditating and they all look at her in unison. Because of that, Devera decides to leave after giving James the address of her other friends. After that, he checks on all of them, only to find out that they're now missing as well. One of them also has the flyers for the Pontifex Institute and the blood writing that the empty man made them do it. Due to that, he calls Nora and informs her about Amanda's missing friends. Then he goes to the chain of rocks bridge to see if there's something there that might give him a clue as to where Amanda is. Yet, the only thing he finds is an empty bottle that he blows and throws away. A little later, he notices that the manhole is open, so he decides to investigate down there. And to his shock, James finds all of Amanda's friends' lifeless bodies, with another writing about the empty man. He immediately reports it to the authorities and is now convinced that his next move should be to the Pontifex Institute. Meanwhile, at a spa salon, Devera is attacked by the empty man, choking and stabbing her with a scissor. However, despite seeing the empty man in front of her, it seems like she's choking and stabbing herself until she finally dies. Because of that, the authorities rule out the incident as a suicide. This news then reaches James, which surprises and frustrates him at the same time. Villiers expresses that cases like these are impossible to solve, hinting to James that he also believes that the teenagers didn't voluntarily take themselves out and that there's a higher power involved in these incidents. On his way home, James sees that the people are doing a prayer vigil for the sudden deaths of the teenagers. After a while, James starts listening to the recording of his conversation with Devera. After that, he browses the internet for any information about the Pontifex Institute and finds out that it was originally called the Pontifex Society, which was a doomsday cult that praises the empty man. Upon further research, he finds an article about a cabin where members of the Pontifex Society died because of an alleged failed occult experiment. Then he looks up tulpa next and discovers that it's some sort of a thought form or a mind-made body with the equation thought plus concentration plus time equals flesh written in the article. At this time, he receives a call from Nora saying that she's outside and that she brings dinner for him. Nora tries to play it cool, but she, later on, breaks down as she's very worried about her daughter, especially due to the recent deaths of her friends. James consoles her and Nora somehow apologizes for something that happened before, indicating that they have a deeper connection than what they're showing. She then asks if she can stay for the night, but she also remembers that they need to maintain boundaries. After a while, James dreams of his family again and an empty chair, eventually waking him up. At this moment, he hears a noise and sees something outside, so he closes the door and grabs his baseball bat. It's like somebody is standing behind the door, yet there's no one when he opens it, but his front door is left open. As the sun rises, James goes to the Pontifex Institute, which now looks like a legitimate support/religious group. After attending a talk, he talks to the preacher and asks him about the empty man. According to the preacher, the empty man is simply a form of meditation that is a focal point for the targeted manifestations of hidden energies. He explains that human thoughts feed and are fed by the sum of all conscious thought that he calls the new sphere. For a simpler example, the preacher tells James about a kid's game that if you repeat your name multiple times, it will become gibberish. But the question is, which is more true, the name or the gibberish? The answer, says the preacher, is the empty man. At this time, he bids goodbye to James, stating that he's happy that he came back. Confused, James points out that it's his first time here. Later on, he asks one of the attendees and asks if he ever saw Amanda lately. Although the young man says no, James notices that he's lying, so he decides to investigate more, going further into the building. Not long after, he finds a sleeping quarter and a group of bald men staring into a black poster. Continuing on his way, he reaches the room where all the records are being hidden. But he doesn't stay long enough, instead making his way to another group session. He moves as carefully as he can, but he still makes a noise, causing the group to stop. But as it turns out, it's not him that the group heard, but someone from the corner as they blow onto their empty bottles altogether. However, he's still caught by two people, so they usher him out of the building. There he finds the young man from earlier waiting for him, admitting that he knows where Amanda is. According to him, she's pretty special for the group, so she was taken to camp elsewhere. Without wasting any more time, James goes downstairs to the said camp. Inside, he finds Pontifex's records of Amanda and her friends. But to his surprise, he has a folder in there as well, but it was empty, so he just didn't mind it. Moving to the next cabin, he plays a tape that's labeled Manifestation 13 and watches how the poor Pontifex members died during what indeed was a failed occult experiment. It's then revealed that it is the haunted cabin from the article that he read before. They were trying to manifest the empty man, but it all went wrong that ultimately led to their demise. Afterward, he hears a noise outside and decides to check on it, finding a large group of hooded people running around a bonfire. However, they all spot him and start running after him, so James immediately goes to his car. He then quickly drives back to town to report to Villiers what he discovered about Pontifex. Unfortunately, being a member of the group is not strong evidence that they have something to do with Amanda's sudden disappearance or the death of her friends. Because of that, he knows that his life is in danger, so he grabs some supplies from his shop and picks up Nora. Bringing her to a hotel, he explains to her that Amanda got caught up with some dangerous cult, so she needs to hide for a while for her safety. At this moment, James asks Nora if Amanda knows about their relationship before, to which she says no. As it turns out, James and Nora had an affair before when their families were still alive. Because of constant guilt, James dreams of his family's accident again and again for so long, and so is this night. But to make matters worse, he now sees the empty man and it tries to attack him. Grabbing the baseball, it suddenly vanishes and he hears the doorbell rings instead. Opening the door, he finds the wasted teddy bear from the cabin sitting on his doorstep. The following day, he decides not to take his medicine and wears his wedding ring again, ready to face his mistake once and for all. He then follows the young man and a couple of other teenage members of the Pontifex into a hospital. There, he discovers that they are worshiping an old man in the ICU that turns out to be Paul. Afterward, James waits for the right moment and takes the young man where he can confront him freely about the truth behind old man Paul and the Pontifex. According to the young man, Paul is what they call the prophet of the other, which serves as an antenna that transmits their thoughts to them. Fed up with all of his cult jargon and bullcrap, James beats him up, but the young man just laughs it off. Desperate for answers, he goes back to Pontifex and digs up the file labeled Manifestation 14. At first, he sees medical records of Paul under the name John Doe because he's totally unknown to everyone in town. But what shocks him more is that Pontifex has everything about him, including his personal life, family photos, medicine prescription, and even the birthday coupon he had on his birthday. And lastly, he sees a picture of himself sitting in the chair that he's been dreaming about. This starts to mess up his brain, so he goes to the hospital, finally finding Amanda taking care of Paul. Because of this, he immediately calls Nora to tell her the good news, but she somehow doesn't remember him or know what he's talking about. At this moment, Amanda reveals to James that everything that he thinks he's been through is not real. She explains that having someone like Paul that can connect to the empty man is rare, and that the gap between him and the last antenna was 500 years. So pontifex takes it up to themselves to create their own antenna, hence the different manifestation experiments and the existence of James. To his shock, Amanda tells him that he has been alive for just 3 days. She continues that the prior manifestations before him keep on failing because they lack a certain aspect of life, which is fear. So, upon creating James, they research thoroughly into putting together every fine detail in his life, and then they place his biggest fear/guilt/trauma last, referring to the death of his family. In a flashback based on the fake memory that Amanda implanted in James, he and Nora committed one last adultery on the night that Nora's husband was buried. Unfortunately, it was also the same night that James' wife and son died in an accident. With all of the pieces together completed plus thought, concentration, and time, they managed to create James La Sombra, their very own tulpa. As it turns out, James manifested during the private group session in Pontifex, and Amanda was also there. He was the one who made the noise that another fake James thought he did. At this time, James' mind goes back to that point in time and runs away until he ends up in the room where he manifested that suddenly transforms into the cave in Bhutan where Paul fell. And to his horror, the empty man bursts out of the giant skeleton and goes inside him. Afterward, he continues running away and goes back home, only to end up in the hospital. Suddenly, James shoots Paul, putting him out of his misery for good. The movie ends with the hospital staff kneeling before James as he embraces his true self, the empty man. This film truly brings horror and thriller to its audience. With very few jump scares, they managed to achieve it by doing a psychological horror approach. Although others might find the film's twisted ending very confusing, The Empty Man dwells in a lot of philosophy to create the whole story, so it's totally fine not to get it in your first watch. Overall, The Empty Man is one of the few movies that actually brings horror and thriller to life, so it is indeed an incredible movie.